I've never seen this level of nervousness about the future or of anxiety. Now, I don't know if it's to do with the economy or if it's to do with many of these students have spent most of their college life, in the COVID period, which was probably a very unpleasant way to go to university. But at any rate, it was striking the difference in attitude. In the short term, I think the second half of the year will be much better than the first half. I think there was a lot of, pretty typical in the press, a lot of excessive doom and gloom. But over the longer term, China's got really deep structural problems, really deep imbalances that it has to work through. And one way or another, it's going to work through these imbalances. And that almost certainly means that growth rates will continue to slow down pretty significantly. It was interesting because last night I had dinner with a couple of people, including a very a well-known economist who's a policy advisor to the government. And I can't mention his name because the dinner was off the record. But the big discussion was, we all know that the growth rate has to be much lower, but will the target next year be 4.5%? Or will they actually be willing to go all the way down to 4%? No one thinks they'll choose a target below that. But it gives you a sense of the way the discussions certainly among the economic policy advisors has evolved over the last couple of years. I'm always a little hesitant to talk too much about the leaders directly, but it is interesting that in the last couple of months, you hear more conversations, obviously never publicly, but you hear more private conversations about whether the problems that China is facing began under Xi Jinping or they began under Hu Jintao. And I would argue that Xi Jinping has had to deal with significant problems. He hasn't dealt with them yet at all, but he's had to deal with significant problems that really emerged in the administration prior to his. And that was, the huge imbalances. Remember that way back in 2007, then Premier Wen Jiabao gave that very famous speech in which he acknowledged the deep imbalances in the Chinese economy. And he promised it would be the top priority of Beijing to rebalance the economy towards more domestic demand. And in fact, that didn't happen. In fact, for the next 5 years, the imbalances got much worse before they finally bottomed out and slowly started to improve until COVID, when they got worse again. So it's a really old problem. The interesting thing to me is the emergence of almost a consensus. It's not a consensus yet, but almost a consensus among economic policy advisors and economic policymakers, people around the PBOC and the Ministry of Finance, about what the sources of China's problems are. We're nowhere near implementing solutions, but at least that's been the big change in the last 3 to 4 years. A recognition that these imbalances have to be resolved, the debt has to be addressed, and the property sector had simply gone way too far and had to be restrained. For a while, there was very rapid expansion of Chinese loans and direct investment into developing countries. Before I moved to China, I used to run trading and capital markets desks on various Wall Street firms specializing in Latin America. So it's an area that I know quite well. And I remember one of my students was, former students, was part of the group within the government responsible for lending into Latin America and into Africa. And I had many discussions with him. This was prior to 2016, when Chinese development lending was growing very quickly. And I told him, it seems to me that you're making a very similar mistake that other countries have made. You'll remember in the 1920s, it was when the US first really went out and invested abroad, particularly in Latin America. And we basically kicked the British out, and we thought it was because we were smarter. And the British said it was because we were mishandling risk. And in the 1930s, we discovered the British were right. Almost all of that lending failed to come back. You saw that with the Soviet Union in the 50s, with the Arab OPEC nations in the 70s, Japan in the 80s. It's sort of an old story. When you first go out, you tend to overestimate your ability to do it. and perhaps underestimate the risks and the costs, because you typically go out during a period of rising commodity prices. And then you learn the hard way that lending to developing countries is not so easy. And I remember, discussing with my friend, your biggest loans are to Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina. And I know from personal experience that investors are very nervous about lending to those countries, and probably for a reason. And I think 2015, 2016 was really a turning point, because you'll remember that's when Venezuela basically restructured all of its debt to China. And that came really as an enormous shock to people within China. And ever since then, you see that development lending, foreign financing, has gone down quite dramatically. It went down, it dropped during COVID, and then it popped up a little bit, but it's still way down from its peak. And I think that there is a growing awareness within Beijing that development lending is indeed quite risky. So I'm not sure we're going to see the kind of expansion people are talking about. And I also, and I'm sure everybody here agrees with me, that the whole debt trap diplomacy theory was a little bit, a little bit wild, a little bit out there. I don't think that's what was happening. I think what was happening in China is a very normal story. We've seen it before. But I think there's a lot more reluctance today to lend into developing countries. I think one problem is that when we talk about the currency, we tend to look at renminbi dollar. And my understanding is that the PBOC looks at two very different measures. One is renminbi CFETs, which is the basket of currencies which it believes on a trade-weighted basis is the correct measure. We don't really know exactly what the division is, but I think dollars are about 20 to 30% of CFETs, and the rest is there's some euro, and the rest are Asian currencies. And if you look at the renminbi against CFETs, it's been pretty stable. So we saw a big decline from March of 2022 until the present. But that simply was the mirror of an extremely rapid rise in the year before March 2022. So you see against CFETs, it's sort of steady, a huge increase, a huge decrease, and we're back to where we were about 2.5 years ago. But they also look at renminbi dollar, and there, as everyone has pointed out, the renminbi. I wouldn't say the renminbi is at a 10-year low. I would say the dollar is really at a 10-year high relative to the renminbi, because it's mostly been dollar strength that explains the weakness in the renminbi, the apparent weakness. Now, which one matters to the PBOC? Unfortunately, it seems like they're stuck worrying about both. And as you know, it's very hard to have two targets, particularly when they're not correlated. They care about the CFETs basket because they care about the renminbi on a trade-weighted basis. And as Louis pointed out, and I think this is a really important point, a stronger renminbi is part of the rebalancing of income towards the household sector. And it's not just Louis and me who think that. It's not a theoretical thing. The former governor of the PBOC said that very, very clearly. He would like to see an appreciating renminbi, because that would transfer income from the manufacturing sector to the household sector. It would overall help rebalance demand. It's only one of many things that matter, but it's one of the things that matter. The problem is that most investors, and not just foreign investors, but wealthy Chinese, don't look at renminbi CFETs. They look at renminbi dollar. And when they see the renminbi weakening against the dollar, the big fear in the PBOC is you get a repeat of 2016, where a weaker currency encourages outflows, and outflows encourage a weaker currency. We're all emerging markets guys, so we all know that story pretty well.